Before we dim the lights and step back into the gritty, smoke-filled streets of 1970s Cleveland, a quick word. The story you are about to hear is a tapestry woven from many threads, decades-old court transcripts, FBI case files, forgotten newspaper headlines, and the whispered testimonies of those who were there. Our sole purpose in piecing this history together is to bring you the most accurate and compelling account possible, to ensure the truth of this incredible conflict is not lost to time. So, settle in, relax, and let us tell you a story not of fiction, but of a very real, very violent man who dared to defy an empire. The world of organized crime in America has always been dominated by a certain image, a certain structure, a code of silence and respect that was imported from the sun-baked villages of Sicily and the rugged coasts of southern Italy. It was a closed world, a secret society where power was passed down through bloodlines and ancient traditions, where an outsider, especially one who wasn't Italian, could never hope to be more than a pawn, a tool to be used and discarded. For decades, this was the unshakable order of things from the crowded streets of New York City to the industrial heartland of the Midwest. But every once in a while, a force of nature emerges, a person so singularly defiant, so recklessly brave, and so utterly unconcerned with the established order that they can shatter decades of tradition through sheer force of will. In the city of Cleveland, that force of nature was a man named Daniel Patrick Greene. He was a man who built his power not on old-world rituals or a network of familial connections, but on a foundation of sheer intimidation, explosive violence, and an almost mythical belief in his own invincibility, a belief he reinforced by styling himself after his Celtic heritage, adopting the color green as his personal banner, and surrounding himself with the symbols of a warrior culture that was as foreign to the mustache-peats of the Mafia as they were intimidating. This is not just a story about a gangster, it is the story of a rebellion, a one-man war fought with car bombs and bullets, a brutal and bloody conflict that would turn the city of Cleveland into a combat zone and rewrite the rules of the American underworld. It is a story that begins not in the opulent back rooms of fancy restaurants, but in the hardscrabble, working-class neighborhoods where survival was a daily battle and ambition was the only currency that could buy you a way out. Danny Greene was born into that world, a son of Irish immigrants in a city where ethnic lines were sharply drawn, and his entire life would be a testament to the fierce pride and stubborn resilience that defined his upbringing. He learned to fight early, not because he wanted to, but because he had to, honing his skills and his fearsome reputation on the streets that would one day become his kingdom and his battlefield. He was a complex figure, a man who could be ruthlessly brutal in his business dealings yet fiercely loyal to those in his community, a Robin Hood figure to some and a terrifying menace to others. To understand the sheer audacity of his war, one must first understand the world he sought to conquer, the colossal power of the Cleveland Mafia, which was then under the iron-fisted control of the legendary crime family led by James Licavoli, a man who operated with the quiet, deadly authority of a born kingpin. For Greene to challenge such an institution was not just ambitious, it was, by all conventional wisdom, a suicide mission. But Greene did not believe in conventional wisdom. He believed in destiny, in the power of the individual, and in the explosive potential of a well-placed stick of dynamite. He believed he was protected by ancient Celtic magic, that he was a modern-day chieftain destined for greatness. And so, with the city of Cleveland as his stage and the Italian syndicate as his foe, Danny Greene, the Irishman, stepped into the spotlight and declared a war that would shock the nation, a war that would be fought not with subtle threats and quiet negotiations, but with a series of deafening blasts that would echo through history, a war that would ultimately prove that even the mightiest empires can be brought to their knees by a single, determined man who is not afraid to die. So, as you close your eyes and let the images form in your mind, picture the skyline of Cleveland, a city of industry and blue-collar grit, and know that beneath its surface, a storm was brewing, a storm that would be unleashed by one man's unshakable belief that he could take on the world and win. The crucible that forged Danny Greene's iron will was the Cleveland neighborhood of Collinwood, a tough, predominantly Irish enclave where the virtues of strength, loyalty, and a willingness to throw a punch were not just admired, they were essential for survival. From his earliest days, young Danny understood the dynamics of power on a visceral level. He saw how the world worked from the bottom up, and he learned that respect was rarely given, it was taken. He was not a large boy in stature, but what he lacked in size he more than made up for with a ferocious temper and a complete refusal to back down from any challenge, no matter how daunting. This fearlessness became his trademark, a quality that would both fuel his rise and seal his fate. He carried the pride of his Irish heritage not as a quaint cultural artifact, but as a weapon, a symbol of his otherness in a city where other ethnic groups had already carved out their own spheres of influence. After a stint in the United States Marines, where he honed his discipline and physical toughness, Greene returned to Cleveland and found his first real foothold of power not in the shadows of the criminal underworld, but in the bright, noisy, and physically demanding world of the Cleveland waterfront. He took a job as a longshoreman, a classic blue-collar profession that was the lifeblood of the city's economy, and it was here that he discovered his innate talent for leadership and organization. He quickly rose through the ranks of the International Longshoremen's Association Local 1317, becoming its president, a position that gave him immense influence over the workforce and, more importantly, over the flow of goods in and out of the port. This was his first taste of real control, and it was intoxicating. He learned how to leverage his position, how to command loyalty through a combination of genuine advocacy for his men and the implied threat of brutal retaliation for any who opposed him. He was a complex leader, a man who could fight for better wages and working conditions for the union members, earning their genuine devotion, while simultaneously orchestrating sophisticated theft rings right under the noses of the shipping companies and law enforcement. This was the beginning of the Greene formula, a public face of a champion for the little guy, and a private enterprise of ruthless criminal ambition. The Union provided the perfect cover and the perfect infrastructure for his burgeoning criminal activities. He could skim funds, orchestrate pilferage on a massive scale, and enforce his will with a small army of loyal longshoremen who owed him their livelihoods. It was during this period that he began to cultivate his now legendary image, the persona of the Celtic warrior. He dyed his hair and mustache a fiery red, embraced the color green in his clothing, his car, and even the roof of his house, and openly spoke of his belief in the old Irish druids and their magic. He claimed to carry a four-leaf clover at all times and genuinely believed he was protected by ancient forces. To his supporters, this was part of his charismatic, folk hero appeal. To his enemies, it was the mark of a dangerous eccentric, a wild card who did not play by the established rules of the underworld. And it was this very reputation that first brought him into direct conflict with the Italian Mafia, who viewed the bustling docks as part of their rightful territory. They saw this flamboyant Irishman not as a partner, but as an obstacle, an upstart who was cutting into their profits and, worse, doing so without their permission. They attempted to muscle in, to demand their traditional cut, expecting Greene to fall in line like every other non-Italian criminal had been forced to do for generations. But Danny Greene did not fall in line. He met their threats with threats of his own, their violence with even more spectacular violence. He understood that his power, while growing, was still fragile, and that to survive against the established might of the Mafia, he needed to be smarter, faster, and far more audacious. He decided that the best defense was a relentless, shocking offense. And so, the stage was set for a conflict that was unlike any the American Mafia had ever faced, not a quiet war of attrition, but a loud, public, and explosively violent war of independence, declared by a man who believed he was blessed by magic and had nothing to lose. The first major shot in Greene's war was not a subtle warning or a quiet disappearance. It was a thunderous declaration of intent that shattered the morning calm and announced to the entire Cleveland underworld that a new, unpredictable power had arrived. The target was Leo "Lips" Masseri, a high-ranking captain in the Licavoli family, a man known for his sharp dressing and his pivotal role in the mob's gambling and loan-sharking operations. Masseri represented the old guard, a man who moved with the assured, quiet confidence of the established regime. The conflict began, as so many mafia conflicts do, over territory and money, specifically the lucrative jukebox and vending machine racket that Greene had muscled his way into. The Italians saw this as an unforgivable intrusion, and Masseri was tasked with reining in the insolent Irishman. But Greene would not be reined in. On a seemingly ordinary day, as Masseri left a barber shop, a car pulled up alongside him. What happened next was not a classic mob hit with silenced pistols. It was a brutal, close-range shotgun blast that tore through the air and left Masseri mortally wounded. While his body was never found, his disappearance sent a shockwave through the criminal fraternity. It was one thing to kill a rival, but to make a high-ranking captain vanish without a trace was a profound insult, a message of absolute disrespect that could not be ignored. This act cemented Greene's reputation not just as a tough guy, but as a genuine threat, a man willing to target the very top of the organization. In response, the Mafia knew they had to eliminate Greene, but his unpredictable routines and his almost supernatural luck made him a frustratingly elusive target. Their first major attempt came in the form of a classic mafia setup. Greene was lured to a meeting at the Theatrical restaurant, a popular mob hangout, under the guise of a peaceful negotiation. It was a trap. As he sat in a booth, a gunman approached from behind and fired a bullet into the back of his head. In what can only be described as a moment of miraculous survival, the bullet struck at a perfect angle, deflecting off his skull and failing to penetrate his brain. Greene, though severely wounded, did not panic. He drew his own weapon and returned fire, managing to escape the restaurant and get himself to a hospital. The story of his survival spread like wildfire, adding another layer to his growing legend. People began to truly wonder if he was, as he claimed, protected by some form of Celtic magic. For Greene, this was not a near-death experience to be feared, but a confirmation of his invincibility. He wore the scar as a badge of honor, a testament to his ability to cheat death itself. This failed assassination marked a critical turning point. It proved to Greene that the mighty Mafia was not omnipotent, that they could make mistakes, and it emboldened him to take the fight directly to them. He realized that to win this war, he couldn't just defend himself, he had to dismantle the enemy's organization piece by piece. He began to employ a strategy of targeted disruption, using his intimate knowledge of the city's streets and his network of informants to strike at the mob's financial heart. He orchestrated hijackings of their trucks, interfered with their gambling operations, and even began to form alliances with other mafia outcasts and rivals, most notably a disgruntled mob enforcer named Ray Ferritto, who would later play a pivotal and tragic role in the saga. Greene's war was no longer a personal feud, it had evolved into a strategic campaign. He understood the power of psychological warfare, and he used it masterfully. Every time he survived an attempt on his life, he would openly mock his would-be assassins, taunting them in public and in the press, further enraging the traditionally secretive and prideful mafia bosses. He turned his own image into a weapon, cultivating the persona of the untouchable Irish rebel, a folk hero for the common people who saw him as a man standing up to the oppressive Italian syndicate. The city of Cleveland became a battlefield, with car bombs, a tactic that would become the signature of this conflict, beginning to explode with terrifying frequency. Parking lots, city streets, and cars themselves were transformed into instruments of terror. The public, once insulated from the mob's internal squabbles, was now acutely aware of the war raging in their midst. The sound of an explosion would send people diving for cover, wondering if this was another chapter in the escalating conflict between the green-clad Irishmen and the Old World Mafia. The police and the FBI found themselves in a constant state of reaction, racing from one bomb site to another, struggling to contain a conflict that seemed to defy all the old rules of organized crime. Greene, meanwhile, operated from a series of safe houses and fortified apartments, always looking over his shoulder, but never showing a hint of fear. He was living his destiny, a warrior chieftain in a modern urban war, and he believed with every fiber of his being that he was winning. The Mafia, humiliated and enraged by Greene's resilience and his very public taunts, realized that conventional methods were failing. They were dealing with a phantom, a man whose luck seemed to defy all logic and whose tactics were as unpredictable as a summer storm. This failure demanded a new, more definitive approach, one that would erase the Irishman from the landscape with absolute finality. The responsibility for crafting this final solution fell upon the shoulders of the Cleveland family's top enforcer, a man as steeped in the old-world traditions of Cosa Nostra as Greene was a rejection of them, Ray Ferritto. Ferritto was a professional, a calm and calculated killer who had been imported from Erie, Pennsylvania, specifically for this one, crucial task. He was not a man given to flamboyant gestures or mystical beliefs, he was a craftsman, and his craft was murder. He studied Greene's patterns with the patience of a predator, learning his routines, his haunts, and the small, seemingly insignificant vulnerabilities in his daily armor. The plan that began to form was not one of a direct confrontation, which Greene seemed to thrive on, but one of stealth and overwhelming force. They decided to use a car bomb, a weapon that was becoming the grim signature of this conflict, believing that not even Danny Greene's legendary luck could survive a direct blast from several sticks of dynamite. The stage for this final act was set at the Lyndhurst apartments, where Greene kept one of his many residences, a second-floor unit that overlooked the parking lot. Ferritto and his accomplices, including a mob associate named Pasquale Cisternino, who managed the apartments, spent days preparing the kill zone. They obtained a powerful radio-controlled explosive device and meticulously wired it to the underside of a car, a green Chevrolet, parked strategically in the lot directly below Greene's apartment. The plan was chilling in its simplicity and audacity: wait for Greene to approach his car, and from a safe distance, press a button that would unleash hell. On the morning of October 6, 1977, the pieces were all in place. Ferritto positioned himself in a nearby apartment with a clear view of the parking lot, his finger hovering near the detonator. The world, unaware of the impending violence, carried on with its morning routines. Meanwhile, Danny Greene was in his apartment, going about his own business, likely feeling the constant, low-grade hum of danger that had become the background music of his life. He had survived so much: a bullet to the head, numerous ambushes, and countless threats, that a sense of invincibility had hardened around him like a shell. He gathered his things, perhaps glanced at the four-leaf clover he always carried, and prepared to leave his apartment. He walked down the stairs and out into the crisp autumn air, heading directly toward the green Chevrolet. He was completely unaware that he was stepping into a carefully laid trap, that his every move was being watched by a man whose only purpose was to end his life. At that moment, the two worlds, the old, methodical mafia and the new, chaotic rebellion, converged in a single, silent parking space. As Greene reached his car, Ferritto, from his hidden perch, pressed the button on the transmitter. The resulting explosion was not merely a loud noise, it was a cataclysm. It tore through the quiet morning with the force of a small earthquake, shattering windows, setting cars ablaze, and hurling shrapnel hundreds of feet in every direction. The green Chevrolet was obliterated, transformed in an instant from a machine of transportation into a twisted, burning coffin. The force of the blast was so immense that it was heard for miles, a sudden, violent punctuation mark in the story of Cleveland. Danny Greene's body was thrown a considerable distance, his life extinguished in a fraction of a second. The man who had believed so fervently in his Celtic protection, who had cheated death so many times, had finally met a force that his luck could not counter. The scene that followed was one of utter chaos and devastation. Sirens wailed, smoke billowed into the sky, and shocked residents emerged to witness the carnage. In the midst of the wreckage, the symbol of his power lay broken. The war was over. The Irishman had finally fallen. But while the explosion ended Danny Greene's life, it did not end his story. In many ways, it amplified it, transforming him from a local Cleveland legend into a national figure, a symbol of reckless courage and defiant resistance. The bomb that killed him also blew the lid off the Cleveland Mafia, triggering an intense FBI investigation that would eventually use the testimony of attorney Ray Ferritto to decimate the very organization that had ordered the hit. In a final, bitter irony, the Mafia's victory was a Pyrrhic one. They had killed the man, but in doing so, they had set in motion the chain of events that would lead to their own downfall. The story of Danny Greene is therefore not just a tale of a gangster's rise and fall, but a complex lesson in the nature of power, the price of defiance, and the unpredictable echoes of violence that long outlived the men who create it. The deafening silence that fell over Cleveland in the immediate aftermath of the car bomb that killed Danny Greene was not one of peace, but of a collective, citywide intake of breath, a moment of stunned disbelief that the vibrant, turbulent, and seemingly unstoppable force that was the Irishman had finally been extinguished. For years, his presence had been a constant in the city's underworld narrative, a recurring character in newspaper headlines and whispered conversations, a man whose defiance was as much a part of the city's identity as its steel mills and lakefront. His death created a vacuum, a sudden and unsettling quiet where once there had been the drumbeat of his one-man war. The initial reaction from the public and the criminal underworld was a complex mix of relief, fear, and for some, a sense of loss. For the ordinary citizens of Cleveland, there was relief that the terrifying era of car bombs and public assassinations might finally be over, that the streets might become safe again. For the members of the Licavoli crime family, there was undoubtedly a sense of grim satisfaction, the belief that order had been restored, that the established hierarchy had proven its ultimate dominance over the chaotic ambition of an outsider. They had, after all, achieved their primary objective, the eradication of their most persistent and humiliating thorn. But this satisfaction was shallow and short-lived, for they had failed to understand a critical truth about their enemy. Danny Greene was more than just a man, he had become an idea, a symbol of resistance, and ideas are notoriously bulletproof. The manner of his death, so public and so brutally spectacular, ensured that his legend would not fade away with his death but would instead be cemented into the folklore of the city and the annals of American crime history. Almost immediately, the FBI, which had been monitoring the gang war with intense interest, launched what would become one of its most successful investigations into organized crime, dubbed Operation Lombardo, named after the then-acting boss of the Cleveland family. The investigation had been building for years, but Greene's murder was the catalyst that broke the case wide open. The crime scene, though horrifying, was a treasure trove of forensic evidence, and more importantly, the sheer audacity of the bombing created immense pressure on law enforcement to produce results. The key that would unlock the entire conspiracy turned out to be the very man the Mafia had entrusted with Greene's assassination. Ray Ferritto, the calm and professional hitman, was arrested not long after the murder. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, Ferritto made the calculation that men of his profession sometimes must. He decided to talk. He became a federal witness, and in a stunning series of courtroom testimonies, he laid bare the entire intricate plot, naming names, detailing meetings, and exposing the command structure of the Cleveland Mafia from the top down. His testimony was devastating. It led to the indictment and conviction of numerous high-ranking mob figures, including the acting boss, James Licavoli, and the underboss, Angelo Leonardo. The bomb that was meant to solidify the Mafia's power instead became the instrument of its near-total destruction in Cleveland. The family was decapitated, its leadership imprisoned, its operations disrupted for a generation. In this profound and ironic twist, Danny Greene achieved in death what he had fought for in life, the crippling of the organization he so despised. His war had ended not with his surrender, but with a victory that echoed through the courtrooms of the nation. His legacy, therefore, is a deeply contradictory one. He was a violent criminal, a thief, an extortionist, and a murderer, a man who brought terror to the streets of his city. Yet, he was also a figure of immense charisma and personal courage, a man who stood up to an entrenched and powerful enemy against impossible odds, and whose actions, directly and indirectly, led to the downfall of that enemy. He remains a polarizing figure, a subject of books, documentaries, and even a major Hollywood film, because his story touches on something fundamental in the human spirit, the allure of the rebel, the fascination with the individual who dares to challenge the system. The green paint on his house has long since faded, the bomb sites have been repaved, and the city of Cleveland has moved on, but the story of Danny Greene, the Irishman who took on the Mafia, endures. It serves as a brutal, cautionary tale about the costs of violence and the fleeting nature of power, while simultaneously captivating us with the timeless drama of one man's unwavering, and ultimately fatal, belief in himself. To truly understand the enduring fascination with Danny Greene, one must look beyond the simple chronology of bombs and bullets and into the deeper psychological and cultural currents that his life and death represented. He was not merely a gangster, he was a master of self-mythology, a man who consciously crafted an image so potent that it continues to capture the imagination decades after his violent end. In an underworld dominated by Italians who cloaked themselves in the shadowy secrecy of Omerta, Greene chose the opposite path. He was flamboyant, outspoken, and highly visible. He understood the power of symbols in a way his enemies did not. While mafia bosses sought to blend into the background, to be powerful but unseen, Greene painted himself and his world in the vibrant, unmistakable color of his heritage. His car was green, his clothes were green, the roof of his house was green. It was a bold, defiant statement, a refusal to be anonymous. This was not just a preference, it was a strategic declaration of identity. He was telling the world, and more importantly, the Mafia, that he was different, that he was proud of his otherness, and that he would not conform to their rules or their aesthetic. This extended to his open embrace of his Celtic roots, his frequent references to Irish history and mythology, and his claimed belief in the protective power of druidic magic and his four-leaf clover. To the pragmatic, logic-driven mafiosi, this must have seemed like madness, the ramblings of an unhinged man. But for Greene, it was a source of immense strength. This self-created mythos provided him with a psychological armor that was as important as any physical protection. It allowed him to frame his brutal criminal campaign not as mere greed or ambition, but as a kind of epic struggle, a modern-day Celtic chieftain battling a foreign empire. This narrative was incredibly powerful, both for himself and for the public. To the working-class Irish and other communities in Cleveland, he could be seen as a folk hero, a Robin Hood figure who, despite his crimes, was standing up to the oppressive, established power structure that had long controlled the city's illicit economy. He was their champion, a local boy who had made good by defying the very people who looked down on them. This perception was bolstered by his history with the Longshoremen's Union, where he had genuinely fought for better conditions for the workers, creating a reservoir of goodwill and loyalty that insulated him to a degree from law enforcement and provided him with a vast network of eyes and ears. The Mafia, in contrast, was often seen as a distant, alien, and predatory force. This fundamental difference in perception was a key weapon in Greene's arsenal. He fought a war not just on the streets, but in the minds of the people of Cleveland. His ability to repeatedly cheat death, surviving the point-blank gunshot to the head, evading numerous other ambushes, only served to reinforce his own legend and the public's perception of his invincibility. Each failed attempt on his life was a public relations victory for him and a humiliating defeat for the Mafia, making them look incompetent and weakening their aura of invulnerability. His habit of openly taunting his pursuers after each failure, sometimes even placing mocking phone calls or sending messages, was a calculated act of psychological warfare designed to enrage and unbalance his opponents, to make them act out of emotion rather than cold calculation. And it worked. The Mafia's frustration with him grew with each failure, ultimately leading them to authorize the overly complex and high-profile car bomb plot that, while successful in killing him, also proved to be their undoing. In the end, Danny Greene's story is the ultimate testament to the power of a narrative. He crafted a story for himself, the story of the untouchable Celtic warrior, and he lived it so completely that he forced everyone around him, from his allies and his enemies to the press and the public, to participate in it. His physical war against the Cleveland Mafia ended in a parking lot in Lyndhurst, but the story he wrote with his life continues to be told and retold, a dark and thrilling chapter in the American saga that reminds us that sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but a compelling idea, and the unshakable will of one man to make that idea real, no matter the cost. The legacy of Danny Greene is a complex tapestry woven with threads of violence, rebellion, and an almost Shakespearean irony that continues to resonate long after the echoes of his car bomb faded into history. To examine his life is to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, the allure of the outlaw, and the fine line between a villain and a folk hero. On one hand, the historical record is unequivocal: Greene was a brutal criminal. He presided over a vast network of extortion, theft, and violence. He was responsible for ordering murders and for creating an atmosphere of terror in Cleveland that culminated in a series of devastating explosions that endangered innocent lives and shattered the peace of a great American city. His actions, regardless of their motivation, caused immense pain and suffering, leaving behind grieving families and a community traumatized by gang warfare. This is the undeniable truth of his career, a truth that cannot and should not be whitewashed by the romanticism that often surrounds his story. Yet, to dismiss him as merely a thug is to ignore the profound impact he had and the unique role he played in the history of organized crime. His war against the Cleveland Mafia was a pivotal event that exposed the inner workings of the syndicate and, through the legal reckoning that followed his death, significantly weakened its power for years. The convictions of Licavoli, Leonardo, and others, secured largely on the back of testimony about his murder, were a landmark victory for federal law enforcement and a demonstration that even the most entrenched criminal empires were vulnerable. In this sense, Greene, however unintentionally, became an agent of their destruction. His life and death serve as a perfect case study for the FBI, a textbook example of how intragang conflict can create fissures that allow investigators to penetrate previously impenetrable organizations. This duality is at the heart of his enduring fascination. He exists in the public memory as a contradiction, a man who operated outside the law, yet whose struggle is often framed as a righteous rebellion against a more powerful, and in many ways more insidious, criminal monopoly. This perception is fueled by his charismatic persona, his flamboyant style, his fierce intelligence, and his unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming odds. He represented the ultimate underdog, and the human spirit is naturally drawn to stories of individuals who dare to challenge Goliath. His embrace of his Irish heritage tapped into a deep well of cultural identity and pride, making him a symbol for an ethnic community that often felt itself on the outside of established power structures. Furthermore, His career highlighted the shifting dynamics of American organized crime in the late 20th century, proving that the old ethnic monopolies were not unassailable and that a determined individual, unburdened by traditional codes and structures, could disrupt the entire system. The tools he used, car bombs, psychological warfare, and a keen understanding of the media, foreshadowed a more modern, more chaotic, and in many ways more terrifying form of criminal enterprise. In the decades since his death, his story has been immortalized in books, articles, and most notably in the Hollywood film Kill the Irishman, which further cemented his status as a legendary figure in the pantheon of American gangsters. The city of Cleveland itself is forever marked by his story. The locations of his life and his death have become macabre points of interest, and the tale is passed down as a foundational piece of local lore. The final, profound irony is that the Mafia's greatest victory, his assassination, was also the catalyst for their greatest defeat. In trying to erase the symbol, they only made it more powerful. Danny Greene's body was laid to rest, but the idea of Danny Greene, the Irishman who refused to kneel, lives on, a permanent and unsettling reminder that in the dark alleyways of history, the most enduring legacies are often written not by the victors, but by the most unforgettable and uncompromising of rebels. To truly grasp the scale of Danny Greene's war, one must pull back the lens from the individual firefights and bombings and examine the sprawling battlefield that was the city of Cleveland during the 1970s, a municipality caught in the grip of a de facto civil war within its criminal underworld that spilled over to touch the lives of every one of its citizens. The conflict was not contained to shadowy back alleys or secluded warehouses. It was waged in broad daylight, in restaurant parking lots, on residential streets, and outside of apartment complexes where families lived and children played. This was a deliberate tactic on Greene's part, a conscious decision to bring the war into the open, to shatter the Mafia's cherished veil of secrecy and make the entire city a witness to their struggle. The sound of explosions became a terrifyingly familiar part of the urban soundscape, each one sending a ripple of fear through the community and a clear message that the conflict was escalating beyond any previous boundaries. The Cleveland Police Department and the FBI found themselves in a constant state of high alert, their resources stretched to the breaking point as they raced from one crime scene to another, often arriving only to find smoldering wreckage and a population gripped by panic. This was not the organized crime of popular imagination, with discreet sit-downs and coded conversations. This was a raw, visceral, and public display of power that more closely resembled the gangland wars of Prohibition-era Chicago than the quiet, corporate-style corruption the Mafia preferred. The sheer number of assassination attempts on Greene alone, estimated to be over a dozen, paints a picture of a city under siege from within. Each attempt required planning, surveillance, and the movement of armed men through the city's neighborhoods, creating a pervasive atmosphere of tension and danger. For the ordinary people of Cleveland, the war between Greene and the Mafia was not a distant drama reported in the newspapers. It was a reality they encountered on their way to work, when they heard a sudden loud noise, or when they saw the flashing lights of police cordons blocking off their streets. Businesses associated with either side, whether willingly or through extortion, lived under the constant threat of being firebombed or vandalized. The Lyndhurst apartment complex where Greene was ultimately killed was not a remote fortress. It was a home to many people who were unknowingly living on the front lines. The bomb that killed him did not just end his life, it traumatized a community, shattering windows, damaging property, and leaving a lasting psychological scar on all who witnessed its aftermath. This public nature of the conflict was a double-edged sword for Greene. On one hand, it provided him with a level of visibility and notoriety that acted as a perverse form of protection, making it harder for the Mafia to simply make him disappear without consequences. On the other hand, it made him the most wanted man in the city, a constant target for both his enemies and the authorities. Yet, he seemed to thrive in this environment of chaos, understanding that in the fog of war, a single, determined individual could outmaneuver a larger, more bureaucratic organization. He moved between safe houses, altered his routines constantly, and relied on his network of loyalists within the Irish community and the Longshoremen's Union for intelligence and support. This network was his eyes and ears, an early warning system that often tipped him off to impending danger and allowed him to slip away at the last second, further reinforcing his legend. The city itself, with its sprawling industrial landscape, its working-class neighborhoods, and its complex ethnic tapestry, was the perfect setting for this kind of war. It was a city of hardened people who understood conflict, a city that had grown accustomed to the rough-and-tumble world of union politics and industrial strife. In a strange way, Danny Greene was a product of Cleveland's soul, tough, resilient, and fiercely independent. His war was a dark reflection of the city's own struggles with economic change and social friction. And when the final, fatal bomb exploded, it did not just silence a man, it marked the end of a bloody and unprecedented chapter in the city's history, a period of time that would forever be remembered as the era when the streets of Cleveland became a battlefield in a private war that was anything but private. The story of Danny Greene cannot be fully told without delving into the intricate web of alliances and betrayals that defined his strategic approach to the war, a complex dance of shifting loyalties where today's ally could become tomorrow's assassin and where the line between friend and foe was constantly being redrawn in blood. Greene understood from the outset that he could not face the monolithic structure of the Cleveland Mafia alone. He needed allies, but in the treacherous waters of the underworld, finding reliable partners was a perilous endeavor. His most significant, and ultimately most fatal, alliance was with a man named John Nardi, a high-ranking official in the Teamsters Union who had his own deep-seated grievances with the Licavoli family. The Mafia had long sought to control the Teamsters, with its massive pension fund and its stranglehold on the transportation industry, and they saw Nardi as an obstacle to their complete dominance. This shared enemy forged a powerful bond between the Irish rebel and the Italian Union man. Together, Greene and Nardi formed a formidable counter-alliance, pooling their resources, their intelligence, and their respective talents for violence and organization. They became the twin pillars of the resistance, coordinating their attacks and presenting a united front that deeply troubled the Mafia leadership. Their partnership demonstrated Greene's pragmatic side. He was an ideological purist about his own independence, but he was perfectly willing to cross ethnic lines and form practical coalitions when it served his greater goal. However, this very alliance also painted an even larger target on their backs, convincing the Mafia that they needed to be eliminated not just as individuals, but as a movement. The Licavoli family knew that breaking this alliance was key to breaking the rebellion, and they began to plot the simultaneous removal of both men. The first to fall was John Nardi. On May 17, 1977, as he left the Teamsters headquarters, a powerful car bomb planted in his Lincoln Continental detonated, killing him instantly. The assassination was a devastating blow to Greene, robbing him of his most powerful and strategically important ally. It was also a clear message from the Mafia: no one was safe, and the war was entering its final, most desperate phase. The death of Nardi isolated Greene, forcing him to rely on a shrinking circle of confidants and increasingly desperate measures. It was in this atmosphere of heightened paranoia and isolation that the final, fateful betrayal took root. The Mafia, recognizing that a direct assault on Greene was too difficult, began to actively recruit from within his own circle or from those on its fringes. They found a willing instrument in Ray Ferritto, a hired gun who, while not a core member of Greene's inner circle, was known in the underworld and could be positioned to gain intelligence. The plot to kill Greene was a masterpiece of criminal treachery, relying on insider information about his daily habits and the complicity of an apartment manager, Pasquale Cisternino, who provided access and surveillance. This was the ultimate betrayal, not from a close friend, but from the very ecosystem of the underworld he operated in, a world where money and self-preservation always trumped loyalty. The Mafia had learned from its previous failures. They no longer sent gunmen who could be outdrawn or outsmarted. Instead, they orchestrated a remote-controlled, impersonal death, a technological solution to the problem of his seemingly supernatural luck. The fact that they succeeded using a bomb, a weapon that Greene himself had employed and that had become the symbol of this conflict, added a layer of poetic, if brutal, justice to his demise. In the end, the alliances he built, while crucial to his early successes, also contributed to his downfall. The partnership with Nardi escalated the conflict to a level that demanded a final resolution, and the treacherous nature of his world meant that trust was the most expensive and rarest commodity of all. The story of these alliances and betrayals is a classic underworld narrative, but in the context of Danny Greene's life, it takes on an epic quality. He was a man who tried to build a kingdom on a foundation of shifting sand, a chieftain who discovered that in the world he had chosen, there were no true clans, only temporary conveniences and permanent ambitions. His war was as much a battle against the inherent treachery of his environment as it was against the Italian Mafia, and in that battle, he ultimately found that no amount of Celtic magic could protect him from a well-planned conspiracy fueled by greed and fear. The psychological portrait of Danny Greene is as compelling and complex as the violent saga he authored across the Cleveland landscape, a deep well of contradictions where fierce intelligence coexisted with superstition, where loyal community advocacy lived alongside ruthless criminality, and where a palpable sense of destiny walked hand in hand with a seeming death wish. To understand the man is to venture beyond the bombs and the bravado and into the mind of someone who genuinely saw himself as a protagonist in an epic Celtic legend, a modern-day warrior chief destined to challenge a corrupt and oppressive empire. This was not merely a public relations facade. By all accounts, Greene internalized this narrative completely, and it became the central engine of his actions and his incredible resilience. His belief in his own invincibility, bolstered by his cherished four-leaf clover and his faith in druidic omens, was not a quirk but a critical component of his psychological armor. In the face of constant, imminent death, this profound self-mythology provided him with a cognitive fortress, allowing him to operate with a calmness and audacity that baffled his enemies and awed his followers. Imagine the mental state required to not only survive a point-blank gunshot to the head but to then mock your assailants publicly, to treat a near-death experience not as a trauma but as a confirmation of your special status. This mindset points to a level of self-belief so absolute that it bordered on the transcendent, allowing him to reframe every assassination attempt not as a failure on his part, but as a failure of his enemy's will and ability. This grand self-perception also explains his flamboyance. The green cars, the green house, the open discussion of his beliefs, these were the acts of a man who wanted to be seen, who wanted his legend to be visible and unmistakable. He was crafting his own story in real time, consciously building a myth that would outlive him. Yet, this existed in stark contrast to other facets of his personality. He was, by many accounts, a man of considerable charm and intelligence, able to negotiate complex union deals and manage a sprawling criminal enterprise with acute strategic foresight. He could be generous and fiercely protective of his neighborhood, the kind of man who would help a struggling family or stand up for someone being bullied, actions that cemented his local reputation as a folk hero. This created a cognitive dissonance for those who knew him. How could the same man who showed such community spirit also be the man who coldly ordered a rival's murder or orchestrated a bombing that could have easily killed bystanders? The answer likely lies in a rigid compartmentalization of his world. In his mind, the war with the Mafia was a just war, a noble struggle against a predatory force, and any tactics used in that war were therefore justified. The community he protected and the empire he fought were separate spheres, and his moral compass was calibrated differently for each. This duality is what makes him such a fascinating and enduring figure. He defies easy categorization as either a pure villain or a pure hero. He was both and neither simultaneously. Furthermore, his relentless provocations of the Mafia, his taunts and his public displays of defiance, suggest a man who was not just unafraid of death, but who may have been drawn to its precipice. There is a certain theatricality to his actions that implies he understood the dramatic value of his own potential martyrdom. He was playing a role on a grand stage, and he knew that a dramatic, violent end would forever seal his legend. This is not to say he sought death, but rather that he was so consumed by the narrative of the fearless Celtic warrior that he was willing to embrace all its possible conclusions, including a bloody and spectacular one. In the end, the psychological forces that made Danny Greene so formidable, his unshakable self-mythology, his compartmentalized morality, and his flirtation with dramatic destruction, were the very forces that made his violent demise almost inevitable. He had written a story for himself that was too epic, too confrontational, too grand to end quietly. He had cast himself as a tragic hero in a classical drama, and on a crisp October morning in 1977, the final, explosive act of that drama was performed for a horrified and captivated city, leaving behind not just a memory of a gangster, but the enduring enigma of a man who truly believed he was the hero of his own epic, right up until the very last second of his life. The role of law enforcement, particularly the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in the saga of Danny Greene is a story in itself, a complex narrative of patient surveillance, missed opportunities, and ultimately, a posthumous victory built upon the very violence they struggled to prevent. Throughout the height of the gang war, the FBI and Cleveland police were often in a reactive posture, racing from one crime scene to another, collecting forensic evidence, and conducting interviews, but consistently finding themselves a step behind the rapidly escalating conflict. The traditional methods of informants and wiretaps, while employed, were challenged by Greene's unconventional tactics and the Mafia's own code of silence. Greene, in particular, was a frustrating target for federal agents. He was intelligent, cautious, and operated with a small, loyal cadre of associates who were less susceptible to being flipped than the more hierarchical and discontented members of the Mafia family. Furthermore, the very public and chaotic nature of the war created a fog that was difficult to penetrate. With car bombs exploding and gunfights occurring in public, the immediate priority was public safety and reaction, not long-term strategic infiltration. The FBI had files on Greene. They knew he was a major figure in the city's criminal underworld, and they were aware of his feud with the Licavoli family, but stopping the violence in real time proved nearly impossible. They were watchers on the sidelines of a gladiatorial contest, gathering evidence that they hoped would one day lead to prosecutions, but largely powerless to stop the bloodshed as it happened. This period was a source of immense frustration for the agents on the ground, who could see the city descending into chaos but found their hands tied by the limitations of jurisprudence and the sheer audacity of the combatants. However, the investigation, known as Operation Lombardo, was a model of patient, methodical police work. While they could not prevent every bombing or assassination, they were meticulously building a massive case, collecting fragments of bombs, analyzing telephone records, and slowly mapping the entire social and criminal network of the Cleveland Mafia. They knew that a conflict of this magnitude could not last forever, and that when it ended, the legal aftermath would be their moment. The assassination of Danny Greene was that moment. The bombing was so brazen, so public, and so devastating that it created an undeniable mandate for justice. The pressure from the public, the media, and political leaders was immense, and the FBI's years of patient investigation now had a singular, horrifying focus. The key break came not from a high-level informant within the Mafia, but from the calculated self-interest of the man they hired to do the job. Ray Ferritto, faced with overwhelming forensic evidence and the prospect of a life sentence, made the cold, logical decision to cooperate. His decision to become a federal witness transformed the investigation overnight. He was not a peripheral figure, he was the triggerman, the man with first-hand knowledge of the entire conspiracy. His testimony provided the narrative that tied all the disparate pieces of evidence together: the meetings, the planning, the financing, and the execution. He gave the FBI the inside story, allowing them to present a coherent and damning case to a jury. His cooperation was a testament to the power of the case the FBI had built. They had enough circumstantial and forensic evidence to convince a professional killer that his only way out was to betray his employers. The subsequent trial was a landmark event, a direct result of the gang war that Greene had started. The testimony laid bare the inner workings of the Cleveland Mafia, exposing its leadership and its brutal methods to the world. Convictions followed for the highest levels of the organization, including boss James Licavoli and underboss Angelo Leonardo, effectively decapitating the crime family and crippling its operations for years to come. In a profound and lasting irony, Danny Greene's war, which had been a nightmare for law enforcement, ultimately delivered them their greatest victory against organized crime in Cleveland. The violence he unleashed and ultimately succumbed to created the conditions that allowed the FBI to achieve what years of peaceful investigation might not have: the dismantling of the very empire he fought. His death, therefore, was not an end, but a catalyst for a legal reckoning that forever altered the criminal landscape of the city. The story of the FBI's involvement is a crucial coda to the tale of Danny Greene, a reminder that even in the midst of seemingly uncontrollable chaos, the wheels of justice are often turning slowly, patiently, and waiting for the moment when the violence of the underworld finally provides the key to its own destruction. The cultural footprint of Danny Greene extends far beyond the archived court transcripts and yellowed newspaper clippings, evolving from a local Cleveland legend into a permanent fixture in the broader American narrative of the gangster, a mythic figure whose life has been refined and romanticized through the powerful lens of popular culture. This transformation began almost immediately after his death, as the dramatic details of his one-man war captured the imagination of writers and filmmakers who recognized the classic, almost cinematic, elements of his story. Here was a protagonist who embodied the ultimate underdog narrative, a man of distinct and proud ethnicity standing against a monolithic, faceless organization, armed with little more than his wits, his courage, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. The very aesthetics of his life were tailor-made for dramatization: the vibrant green color scheme, the mystical references to Celtic lore, the series of miraculous survivals, and the final, explosive demise. It is a story that contains the primal rhythms of an ancient epic, transposed onto the gritty, urban landscape of 1970s industrial America. The most significant and widely seen portrayal came with the 2011 film Kill the Irishman, based on the book of the same name by Rick Porrello, which brought Greene's war to a national and international audience. Starring Ray Stevenson as Greene, the film necessarily condensed and dramatized events but captured the essential spirit of the man, his charisma, his defiance, and the sheer scale of his audacious campaign. The film solidified his image as a folk hero for a new generation, focusing on his rebellion against the Mafia and his connection to his community, while inevitably glossing over the more brutal and nihilistic aspects of his criminal career. This is the natural process of myth-making. The complexities and moral ambiguities are sanded down to create a more streamlined and compelling archetype. The real Danny Greene, a man who ordered murders and planted bombs, is softened into a romantic rebel, a symbol of resistance. This cultural repackaging is not unique to Greene. It is a fate shared by many infamous historical figures, from Billy the Kid to Al Capone, whose legacies are often simplified into a compelling, marketable essence. For Cleveland, this cultural absorption has made Greene a paradoxical point of pride, a dark tourist attraction. The sites of his life and death have become locations of macabre interest, and his story is a foundational piece of the city's modern identity, a tale told to convey the toughness and the rebellious spirit of the community. He is remembered not just as a criminal, but as a force of nature, a part of the city's historical fabric. Books, documentaries, and countless online forums continue to dissect his life, ensuring that the legend remains alive and subject to endless analysis and fascination. This enduring interest speaks to something fundamental in the human psyche, a fascination with individuals who live by their own rules, who challenge authority, and who face their destiny with unwavering courage, even if that destiny is a tragic one. Greene's story taps into the timeless allure of the outlaw, the figure who exists outside societal norms and who, through sheer force of will, carves out their own kingdom, however briefly. In death, Danny Greene achieved a form of immortality that he likely would have appreciated, becoming larger than life, his story stripped of its mundane horrors and elevated into the realm of legend. The man who so carefully cultivated his own image would doubtless be satisfied to know that the narrative he worked so hard to create, the narrative of the Celtic warrior chieftain, has ultimately prevailed in the public consciousness, ensuring that the name Danny Greene would not be forgotten in the annals of American crime, but remembered, debated, and dramatized for generations to come, a permanent and fiery chapter in the long and violent story of the underworld. To place Danny Greene within the broader context of American organized crime is to recognize him not as an anomaly but as a significant harbinger of a shifting paradigm, a symbol of the erosion of the traditional mafia's invincibility and the rise of a more fragmented, entrepreneurial, and volatile criminal landscape. For the first half of the 20th century, the narrative of organized crime in America was overwhelmingly an Italian one, dominated by the structure, rituals, and ethnic exclusivity of La Cosa Nostra. This was a world governed by strict codes of conduct, a clear hierarchy, and a preference for operating in the shadows, using corruption and intimidation to achieve its goals while maintaining a veneer of legitimate business. Into this entrenched system, figures like Greene emerged as disruptive forces, proving that the monopoly could be broken. He was part of a small but significant wave of non-Italian gangsters, including the Jewish mobsters of Murder Incorporated and the Irish Westies of Hell's Kitchen, who demonstrated that ruthless ambition and tactical innovation could compete with old-world tradition. What set Greene apart was the sheer audacity of his direct, public, and sustained challenge. He did not simply operate in a parallel criminal economy, he explicitly declared war on the established order and fought it to a standstill, something few others had ever dared or lived long enough to accomplish. His methods, particularly his reliance on car bombs, were a dramatic departure from the Mafia's preferred tactics of silent shootings and hidden burials. The bomb was a weapon of terror and spectacle, designed to send a message not just to the victim, but to the entire city. It was a tool of psychological warfare that Greene wielded with brutal effectiveness, understanding that in a media-saturated age, a loud explosion created more powerful and lasting headlines than a quiet disappearance. This shift towards more spectacular violence can be seen as a precursor to the later, even more chaotic eras of drug cartels and street gangs, where public displays of power became a central part of the criminal brand. Furthermore, Greene's operation was a leaner, more personal enterprise compared to the bureaucratic and often sluggish mafia families. He was not burdened by the need to support a vast network of soldiers or to get approval from a commission. He could act quickly, decisively, and unpredictably, making him a uniquely difficult target. His success, however brief, signaled that the old models were vulnerable, that a single determined individual with enough courage and a willingness to embrace chaos could disrupt the entire ecosystem. His war also exposed a critical weakness in the Mafia's armor, their inability to effectively deal with a charismatic, non-Italian opponent who enjoyed a degree of public support and who did not play by their rules of engagement. Their frustration with him led them to make mistakes, to act out of emotion rather than cold calculation, culminating in the overly complex and high-profile bombing that killed him but also destroyed them. The legal aftermath of Greene's assassination, with the successful prosecution of the Cleveland family's leadership, served as a blueprint for other federal investigations, demonstrating the potency of using one part of the criminal world to destroy another through turncoat witnesses. In the decades since his death, the power of the traditional American mafia has significantly waned, due in no small part to RICO statutes and the kind of intragang conflicts that Greene's war exemplified. While he was certainly not the sole cause of this decline, his life stands as a powerful and early indicator of the coming change. He was a figure of transition, a bridge between the era of tightly controlled ethnic crime syndicates and the more decentralized, opportunistic, and ferociously violent criminal world that would follow. Danny Greene proved that the empire could be struck, and that the blow, even if it killed the striker, could set in motion the forces that would eventually lead to the empire's fall. His legacy, therefore, is not just the story of one man's rebellion, but a pivotal moment in the evolution of American crime, a bloody and dramatic demonstration that the old order was not destined to last forever. The physical landscape of Cleveland itself served as a silent but essential character in the drama of Danny Greene's life and death, its neighborhoods, union halls, and parking lots providing the stage upon which his personal epic of rise and fall was performed. The city during the 1970s was a place of immense contrast, a proud blue-collar metropolis still clinging to its industrial might while showing the early signs of the economic decline that would define the subsequent decades. This environment of grit, pride, and underlying tension was the perfect breeding ground for a figure like Greene. The Collinwood neighborhood where he was raised was a tight-knit Irish enclave where loyalty was paramount and a reputation for toughness was a valuable currency, lessons he learned early and carried with him throughout his life. The Cleveland waterfront, with its sprawling docks and constant flow of goods, was more than just a place of employment. It was a university of criminal opportunity where he learned the arts of pilferage, extortion, and union manipulation, building the foundation of his power base and his network of loyalists. The city's ethnic patchwork, with clearly defined Italian, Irish, and Eastern European neighborhoods, created the tribal tensions that fueled his conflict. This was not an abstract battle, but a very territorial one, a fight for control of specific streets, specific businesses, and specific rackets. The Theatrical restaurant, where he survived the gunshot to the head, was a known mob haunt, a symbol of the established order he was challenging, and his survival there became a legendary tale told in bars and union halls across the city. His various safe houses and apartments, particularly the second-floor unit at the Lyndhurst apartments, were his castles and his fortresses, temporary domains from which he planned his next move, always looking out the window with a wary eye. The parking lot of that apartment complex is now a place of grim pilgrimage, a mundane piece of asphalt forever marked by the catastrophic violence that occurred there. Every significant location in his story is imbued with this dual nature. They are ordinary Cleveland places that were suddenly and violently transformed into landmarks of a gangland war. The constant movement of his life, from the docks to the union halls to the bomb sites, paints a portrait of a man who knew his city intimately, who used its geography to his advantage, and who ultimately could not escape its dangers. The explosions that rocked the city did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in its heart, scarring its physical space and its collective psyche. The sound of a car backfiring could send a chill through a neighborhood, a reminder that the war was real and that no one was entirely safe. For the people of Cleveland, the story of Danny Greene is not a remote historical event. It is woven into the very streets they walked. It is the story of a restaurant where a man was shot and walked away, of a union hall where a powerful alliance was forged, of a parking lot where a rebellion was violently extinguished. The city has changed since the 1970s. It has reinvented itself, cleaned up its downtown, and sought to move beyond its reputation for violence and corruption. But the ghost of Danny Greene remains, a spectral presence in the city's memory, a reminder of a time when Cleveland was the stage for one of the most audacious and violent personal wars in the history of American crime. To understand the man, one must understand the city that made him, for he was, in every sense, a product of Cleveland, its toughness, its pride, its conflicts, and its enduring capacity for generating legends that are as compelling as they are cautionary. The weapon of choice that came to define the Cleveland gang war, the car bomb, was more than just a tool of assassination. It was a psychological instrument of terror that transformed the city's everyday landscape into a potential battlefield and announced a new level of brutality in American organized crime. Unlike a silent bullet from a hidden shooter, the car bomb was a statement of indiscriminate and overwhelming force, a weapon that did not discriminate between its intended target and any innocent bystanders who might be nearby. Its use by both Greene and the Mafia signaled a departure from the old-world rules of engagement, where violence, while ever present, was often targeted and discreet. The bomb was chaos incarnate, a device that could not be entirely controlled, and its deployment showed a willingness to escalate the conflict to a point of no return. For Danny Greene, the bomb was a great equalizer. He did not have the vast network of hitmen that the Mafia could call upon, but with knowledge of explosives and a willingness to use them, he could strike devastating blows against his more powerful enemy. Each successful bombing he orchestrated was a propaganda victory, demonstrating that the mighty Mafia was vulnerable, that their cars, their businesses, and their associates could be turned against them in a fiery instant. The sound of the explosion would echo for blocks, the smoke would rise for all to see, and the news would spread like wildfire, amplifying the fear and uncertainty within the ranks of his enemies. For the Mafia, initially reluctant to use such messy and attention-grabbing methods, the adoption of the car bomb was a sign of their desperation and frustration. They had tried guns and they had failed. Greene seemed to be protected by a combination of luck, paranoia, and his own fierce retaliation. The bomb offered a solution, a remote, impersonal method of killing that, in theory, minimized the risk to the assassins. The planning that went into the bomb that killed Greene was meticulous, involving surveillance, insider help, and a radio-controlled detonator, representing a significant investment of time and resources. It was the ultimate expression of their desire to erase him completely. But the very public nature of this method, while successful in its primary goal, also proved to be their undoing. The devastation was so complete, the crime scene so large, that it provided a wealth of forensic evidence for the FBI to analyze. The bomb fragments, the wiring, the specific type of dynamite, all became pieces of a puzzle that, when combined with the testimony of Ray Ferritto, created an unassailable case against the mob bosses who had ordered the hit. The car bomb, intended to be the final, silencing word in the conflict, instead became the loudest piece of evidence in the courtroom. The legacy of this tactic in Cleveland is a dark one. It left a lasting scar on the city's memory, a period when the simple act of starting your car could fill you with dread. It also left a mark on the history of law enforcement, serving as a brutal lesson in the evolving tactics of organized crime and forcing agencies to develop new expertise in bomb disposal and forensic explosives analysis. The Cleveland War, with its soundtrack of explosions, demonstrated that the American underworld was capable of a new, more terrifying form of violence, one that would foreshadow the tactics of later criminal organizations and even domestic terrorists. The car bomb was the signature of the Danny Greene era, a violent punctuation mark that ended sentences and lives, and its echo can still be faintly heard in the stories told about the time the streets of Cleveland became a war zone. The figure of Ray Ferritto, the man who pressed the button that ended Danny Greene's life, stands as a crucial and complex character in this saga, a study in cold professionalism, calculated self-interest, and the ultimate fragility of underworld loyalties. He was not a hot-headed Cleveland thug driven by personal vendetta or ethnic hatred. He was an imported specialist, a contract killer from Erie, Pennsylvania, brought in precisely because he was an outsider, a man without local ties who could operate with clinical detachment. This made him the perfect instrument for a job that had frustrated the local talent for years. Ferritto represented the business-like side of murder, a stark contrast to Greene's passionate, almost ideological, approach to his war. Where Greene was flamboyant and saw himself as a Celtic chieftain, Ferritto was quiet, methodical, and saw the assassination as a job of work, a problem to be solved with patience and precision. He spent weeks studying Greene's patterns, learning the rhythm of his life at the Lyndhurst apartments, and orchestrating the placement of the bomb with the care of an engineer. His presence in a nearby apartment, finger on the detonator, was the culmination of this meticulous planning, the moment when the abstract plot became a deadly reality. His actions in that moment were not driven by rage, but by a cool focus on completing his assigned task. However, the true defining moment of Ray Ferritto's role in history came not on October 6, 1977, but in the interrogation room afterwards. When confronted by the FBI with the overwhelming evidence they had gathered, evidence that tied him inextricably to the scene and the conspiracy, Ferritto made the pragmatic decision that so many hired killers before and since have made: he chose to cooperate. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, or even the death penalty, his loyalty to the mafia bosses who had hired him evaporated. It was a transaction, pure and simple. They had paid him for a job, but they could not protect him from the consequences, so the contract was null and void. His decision to become a federal witness was a devastating blow to the Cleveland Mafia. He was not a low-level foot soldier who could only provide limited information. He was the triggerman, the person with direct, first-hand knowledge of the entire plot from its conception to its execution. His testimony provided the narrative thread that connected the mob leadership to the murder, giving the jury a compelling, insider's account of the conspiracy. He explained the meetings, the planning sessions, the roles of each participant, and the final, fatal moment itself. Without Ferritto's cooperation, the case against Licavoli, Leonardo, and the others would have been far more circumstantial and difficult to prove. His turn from hired assassin to star witness is a classic underworld narrative, but it highlights a fundamental truth about the criminal world. When faced with the full weight of the justice system, the bonds of omerta often prove to be weaker than the instinct for self-preservation. Ferritto's life after testifying was spent in the shadowy world of the Witness Protection Program, a fate that seems almost poetic for a man who traded one form of anonymity for another. He had eliminated the flamboyant rebel, only to himself disappear into the quiet, fearful obscurity that Greene had so vehemently rejected. In the end, Ray Ferritto is a reminder that in these stories of larger-than-life figures like Danny Greene, there are always the quieter, more pragmatic men in the background, the ones who do the dirty work that allows the empires to stand and the legends to be born. And sometimes, it is these very men who, through their own calculated choices, become the architects of those empires' downfalls and the final, definitive chroniclers of the legends they helped to create. The figure of Ray Ferritto, the man who pressed the button that ended Danny Greene's life, stands as a crucial and complex character in this saga, a study in cold professionalism, calculated self-interest, and the ultimate fragility of underworld loyalties. He was not a hot-headed Cleveland thug driven by personal vendetta or ethnic hatred. He was an imported specialist, a contract killer from Erie, Pennsylvania, brought in precisely because he was an outsider, a man without local ties who could operate with clinical detachment. This made him the perfect instrument for a job that had frustrated the local talent for years. Ferritto represented the business-like side of murder, a stark contrast to Greene's passionate, almost ideological, approach to his war. Where Greene was flamboyant and saw himself as a Celtic chieftain, Ferritto was quiet, methodical, and saw the assassination as a job of work, a problem to be solved with patience and precision. He spent weeks studying Greene's patterns, learning the rhythm of his life at the Lyndhurst apartments, and orchestrating the placement of the bomb with the care of an engineer. His presence in a nearby apartment, finger on the detonator, was the culmination of this meticulous planning, the moment when the abstract plot became a deadly reality. His actions in that moment were not driven by rage, but by a cool focus on completing his assigned task. However, the true defining moment of Ray Ferritto's role in history came not on October 6, 1977, but in the interrogation room afterwards. When confronted by the FBI with the overwhelming evidence they had gathered, evidence that tied him inextricably to the scene and the conspiracy, Ferritto made the pragmatic decision that so many hired killers before and since have made: he chose to cooperate. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, or even the death penalty, his loyalty to the mafia bosses who had hired him evaporated. It was a transaction, pure and simple. They had paid him for a job, but they could not protect him from the consequences, so the contract was null and void. His decision to become a federal witness was a devastating blow to the Cleveland Mafia. He was not a low-level foot soldier who could only provide limited information. He was the triggerman, the person with direct, first-hand knowledge of the entire plot from its conception to its execution. His testimony provided the narrative thread that connected the mob leadership to the murder, giving the jury a compelling, insider's account of the conspiracy. He explained the meetings, the planning sessions, the roles of each participant, and the final, fatal moment itself. Without Ferritto's cooperation, the case against Licavoli, Leonardo, and the others would have been far more circumstantial and difficult to prove. His turn from hired assassin to star witness is a classic underworld narrative, but it highlights a fundamental truth about the criminal world. When faced with the full weight of the justice system, the bonds of omerta often prove to be weaker than the instinct for self-preservation. Ferritto's life after testifying was spent in the shadowy world of the Witness Protection Program, a fate that seems almost poetic for a man who traded one form of anonymity for another. He had eliminated the flamboyant rebel, only to himself disappear into the quiet, fearful obscurity that Greene had so vehemently rejected. In the end, Ray Ferritto is a reminder that in these stories of larger-than-life figures like Danny Greene, there are always the quieter, more pragmatic men in the background, the ones who do the dirty work that allows the empires to stand and the legends to be born. And sometimes, it is these very men who, through their own calculated choices, become the architects of those empires' downfalls and the final, definitive chroniclers of the legends they helped to create. The profound and lasting impact of Danny Greene's rebellion on the very structure and self-perception of the Cleveland Mafia cannot be overstated, for his war inflicted a wound from which the traditional crime family would never fully recover, fundamentally altering its power, its prestige, and its future. Prior to Greene's ascent, the Cleveland Syndicate under figures like James Licavoli was a formidable and respected power within the national criminal landscape, a well-organized entity with deep roots in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and political corruption. It operated with a sense of impunity and order, its leaders confident in their authority and the inviolability of their territory. The sudden eruption of a bloody and public conflict with a non-Italian outsider was not just an inconvenience, it was an existential crisis. Greene's challenge was a direct affront to their authority, a rejection of their right to rule the city's underworld, and his ability to survive their repeated assassination attempts made them look weak and incompetent in the eyes of the criminal world, both locally and nationally. The resources they had to divert to this single, protracted fight, money, manpower, and mental energy, weakened their other operations and left them vulnerable. The constant state of alert, the need for heightened security, and the paranoia that Greene sowed within their ranks disrupted the smooth, corporate-like functioning they prized. The decision to finally use a massive car bomb, while successful in eliminating Greene, was an act of desperation that violated the Mafia's own preferred methods of quiet, deniable violence and brought an unprecedented level of law enforcement scrutiny upon them. The bombing was so spectacular that it demanded a response, and the FBI's Operation Lombardo, which had been building for years, now had a clear, horrifying, and public crime to focus all its energies on. The subsequent cooperation of Ray Ferritto was the fatal blow. His testimony did not just solve a murder, it provided a detailed roadmap of the family's leadership and its inner workings, leading to the successful prosecution and imprisonment of its top echelon. With Licavoli, Leonardo, and others serving long prison sentences, the family was decapitated. The institutional knowledge, the networks of corruption, and the commanding presence of its old guard were gone, creating a power vacuum that was filled by less capable, less disciplined, and often violently fractious successors. The Cleveland Mafia never regained the national stature or the local dominance it enjoyed before the war with Danny Greene. His one-man crusade, while costing him his life, had effectively broken the back of the organization. The irony is thick and inescapable. In their effort to crush a rebellion and reaffirm their power, they triggered the series of events that would lead to their own near destruction. The story of the Cleveland Mafia in the latter half of the 20th century is thus divided into two eras, before Danny Greene and after Danny Greene. He became their defining adversary, the specter that haunted their peak years and the catalyst for their steep decline. The money and effort spent trying to kill him, the legal consequences that followed his death, and the loss of key leadership created a downward spiral from which they could not recover. While vestiges of the organization persisted, it was a shadow of its former self, its power diluted and its reputation tarnished. The legend of Danny Greene, therefore, is not merely the story of a gangster's rise and fall, it is also the story of how a single, determined individual, through sheer force of will and a refusal to submit, can topple a Goliath, proving that even the most entrenched and powerful structures are vulnerable to the relentless assault of a man who believes he has nothing to lose. The personal life of Danny Greene, existing in the shadow of his very public war, remains a realm of compelling contrasts, offering glimpses of the man behind the myth and revealing the human complexities that his brutal profession often obscures. While he cultivated the image of a solitary Celtic warrior, he was, in fact, a man with deep personal attachments, a father, and a figure who craved a sense of community and belonging even as his actions isolated him in a world of constant danger. He was married and had children, and by many accounts, he was a devoted father who sought to provide for his family and shield them from the violence that defined his professional life. This created an impossible dichotomy, a man trying to maintain a semblance of normal domesticity while simultaneously orchestrating a gangland war from payphones and moving cars. The psychological toll of this double life must have been immense, the constant fear for his own safety now compounded by the terror that his enemies might target his loved ones to get to him. This need to protect his family undoubtedly influenced his movements and his strategies, adding another layer of complexity to his already paranoid existence. Beyond his immediate family, his relationship with his community in the Collinwood neighborhood was a cornerstone of his identity. He was not a recluse, he was a known and often generous presence, a man who would help a neighbor in need, intervene in local disputes, and be seen as a protector of the community against outside threats, which, in his worldview, included the predatory Italian Mafia. This role as a local champion was a source of genuine pride for him and a key reason why he maintained a reservoir of loyalty and support that proved so valuable throughout his war. People who knew him personally often spoke of his charisma, his sharp intellect, and his surprising charm, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the cold-blooded killer who could order a bombing without hesitation. He was a man who could quote Irish poetry and discuss history one moment, and plan a violent criminal enterprise the next. This ability to compartmentalize his life was likely essential for his sanity, allowing him to function in two diametrically opposed worlds. Yet, this compartmentalization could not have been perfect. The stress, the constant vigilance, and the ever-present shadow of death must have weighed heavily on him, perhaps fueling the very flamboyance and recklessness that became his trademark. His open embrace of Celtic mythology and his belief in his own invincibility can be seen not just as a strategic affectation, but as a necessary psychological crutch, a way to mentally armor himself against the overwhelming odds he faced every single day. He created a narrative of destiny and magical protection to make sense of the chaos he both generated and inhabited. In his final years, as the war intensified and allies like John Nardi were killed, this personal life would have become increasingly constricted and fraught with peril. The safe houses, the constant changing of vehicles, the inability to establish a stable home, all of it points to a man whose personal world was shrinking under the pressure of his public war. The man who valued family and community was ultimately forced into a nomadic and isolated existence, his personal connections becoming potential vulnerabilities. The bomb that killed him in a public parking lot not only ended his life but also severed these personal bonds, leaving behind a legacy of what-ifs and a family forever marked by his violent choices. To understand Danny Greene fully, one must acknowledge this personal dimension, not to excuse his crimes, but to comprehend the full human cost of the path he chose. He was not a two-dimensional comic book villain. He was a father, a neighbor, and a man of fierce loyalties who fought a war that consumed every aspect of his being, leaving no part of his life untouched by the violence that he both delivered and, in the end, received. The financial underpinnings of Danny Greene's war reveal a great deal about the practical realities of waging a sustained insurgency against a deeply entrenched criminal empire, highlighting his resourcefulness and the diverse, if illicit, revenue streams that fueled his rebellion. Unlike the Mafia, which had decades of accumulated wealth and a sprawling portfolio of illegal enterprises, Greene's financial base was more agile, more personal, and built from the ground up through a combination of brute force, strategic positioning, and clever exploitation of his legitimate fronts. His initial power and capital were largely accrued during his tenure as president of the International Longshoremen's Association Local 1317. The docks of Cleveland were a river of gold for a man with his ambitions, and he siphoned from it relentlessly. He orchestrated sophisticated pilferage operations, where high-value goods would simply disappear from shipping containers, to be sold on the black market. He enforced kickbacks from union members and shook down shipping companies for favorable treatment, using the threat of crippling strikes or accidents as his leverage. This control over the waterfront provided him with a steady, significant income and, just as importantly, a network of loyal men who were his eyes and ears on the street. After leaving the Union, either by force or by choice as his notoriety grew, Greene transitioned into other rackets. He became a master of the jukebox and vending machine industry, a classic mob turf that he aggressively muscled into, demanding a cut from operators or seizing territories outright. Loan sharking was another cornerstone of his empire. He would lend money at exorbitant interest rates to gamblers, small business owners, and other desperate individuals, enforcing repayment with the threat of brutal violence. He was also deeply involved in hijacking trucks, a high-risk, high-reward enterprise that required precise intelligence and a team willing to use force. These operations required capital for upfront costs, paying off informants, purchasing weapons, renting cars, and maintaining safe houses. The war itself was an incredibly expensive undertaking. Bombs were not cheap to build reliably and safely, at least as safely as such a thing could be managed. They required explosives, detonators, wiring, and timers or radios, all of which had to be sourced discreetly. Paying the men who carried out the bombings and shootings required significant sums of cash, as their work entailed the highest possible risk. Bribes were another major expense. Greasing the palms of police officers, building superintendents, and other officials was essential for gathering intelligence, gaining access to locations, and ensuring a degree of operational security. Greene also had significant personal expenses. His flamboyant image, while part of his brand, cost money. The distinctive green cars, which were frequently replaced after being identified by his enemies, the clothing, and the upkeep of his various residences. Furthermore, he had to provide for his family, often requiring them to live separately from him for their own safety, which meant maintaining multiple households. The constant pressure of the war also disrupted his cash flow. As the Mafia targeted his operations and law enforcement scrutiny increased, his various rackets would have been disrupted, forcing him to adapt constantly and find new sources of revenue. This financial pressure may have contributed to his increasingly audacious tactics, as the need to strike decisive blows against the Mafia became intertwined with the need to assert his dominance and secure his financial future. Unlike the corporate-style Mafia, Greene's financial empire was a personal fiefdom, directly tied to his own energy, cunning, and reputation for violence. When he died, that empire died with him. There was no structure, no board of directors, no underboss to assume control. The money, whatever was left of it, likely disappeared, seized by the authorities, stolen by former associates, or simply lost. The financial story of Danny Greene is thus a testament to the high cost of rebellion, demonstrating that even a one-man war requires a vast and relentless effort of fundraising, a dark entrepreneurship that fueled the bombs, the bullets, and the legend of the Irishman who dared to challenge the mob. The immediate and visceral aftermath of the car bomb that killed Danny Greene created a crime scene of such devastation that it became permanently seared into the memory of the city, a gruesome spectacle that marked the definitive, violent end of an era and presented investigators with a forensic puzzle of monumental proportions. The force of the explosion was not merely loud, it was cataclysmic, tearing the green Chevrolet apart as if it were made of paper and hurling shrapnel and debris in a wide, deadly radius across the Lyndhurst apartments parking lot. The sound echoed for miles, a sudden, terrifying crack of noise that caused people to duck instinctively and sent birds scattering from trees in a panicked cloud. The first responders arriving on the scene were met with a vision of hell: twisted, burning metal, the acrid smell of cordite and gasoline, shattered glass from dozens of nearby apartment and car windows, and the chilling, pervasive silence that often follows a moment of extreme violence. The task of identifying the victim was a grim and immediate challenge. The blast had been so powerful that Greene's body was thrown a significant distance from the epicenter, and the damage was extensive. Yet, for those familiar with the ongoing war, there was little doubt about who the target had been. The location, the method, and the sheer audacity of the attack pointed to one conclusion: the Irishman was dead. As news of the bombing spread, a macabre crowd began to gather, held back by police tape, their faces a mixture of horror, fascination, and a grim sense of inevitability. They had known it would end like this, but the reality was still shocking. For the residents of the apartment complex, the event was a traumatic invasion of their safe space, their home suddenly transformed into the epicenter of a national news story. The FBI and Cleveland Police Bomb Squad moved in with a methodical urgency, knowing that this was the crime scene that could break the entire case open. They cordoned off a massive area and began the painstaking process of collecting evidence, a task akin to gathering the pieces of a shattered vase. Every fragment of metal, every strand of wire, every speck of unusual material was bagged and tagged. They sifted through the dirt and gravel, looking for the components of the bomb itself, the dynamite wrappers, the battery fragments, the remnants of the radio receiver that had been used as a remote detonator. This forensic evidence was the silent witness that would not lie, the physical proof that would corroborate or contradict any testimony they might later obtain. The specific type of dynamite, the wiring techniques, the make and model of the radio, all of these details were clues that could be traced back to their purchasers or their handlers. The scene was also a treasure trove of other evidence, tire tracks from the getaway car, potential witnesses who might have seen the bombers planting the device, and shell casings from the small arms fire that had reportedly been exchanged just before the explosion. The investigation was a race against time and against the underworld's code of silence. They knew the conspirators would be scattering, alibis would be solidified, and evidence would be destroyed. The pressure from the public and the media for an arrest was immense. The city demanded justice for the brazen act of terrorism that had shattered its peace. The devastation of that parking lot, therefore, was not an end, but a beginning. It was the genesis of the final, legal chapter of the war, the crime scene that would ultimately provide the physical evidence needed to dismantle the criminal organization that had ordered the hit. The bomb that was meant to silence Danny Greene forever instead gave his story its most powerful and lasting voice, echoing not in the streets of Cleveland, but in the hallowed halls of a federal courtroom. The long and complex legal proceedings that followed the assassination of Danny Greene represented the final, decisive battle in the war he started, a conflict moved from the violent streets of Cleveland to the sterile, rule-bound arena of the federal courtroom where words and evidence replaced bombs and bullets as the weapons of choice. The centerpiece of the government's case was the testimony of Ray Ferritto, the hired gunman who had turned government witness, and his presence on the stand transformed the trial from a simple murder case into a comprehensive expose of the Cleveland Mafia's inner workings. Ferritto, now stripped of his role as a clandestine operator, became a narrator, calmly and methodically detailing the entire conspiracy for the jury. He described the meetings with Mafia leaders, the planning sessions in back rooms and cars, the acquisition of the explosives, the meticulous surveillance of Greene's habits, and the final, fateful moments when he pressed the button on the detonator from his hidden perch. His testimony was not given flamboyantly or with apparent remorse, but with a chilling matter-of-factness that lent it a powerful credibility. He was a professional explaining his work, and his lack of emotion made the calculated nature of the murder all the more stark and damning for the defendants. The prosecution then layered Ferritto's story with a mountain of physical evidence collected from the bomb site, fragments of the radio-controlled detonator, specific brands of wiring and tape, and chemical analysis of the explosives, all of which corroborated the witness's account and created an unassailable chain of evidence linking the mob bosses to the crime. The defense attorneys, representing figures like James Licavoli and Angelo Leonardo, were left with few options. They could not deny that the murder had occurred, so they were forced to attack Ferritto's character, painting him as a liar, a paid assassin, and a man who would say anything to save his own skin. They argued that his testimony was a work of fiction, a story concocted to secure a reduced sentence, and that the government was so desperate for a conviction that they were willing to make a deal with the devil himself. This classic courtroom strategy, however, was ultimately unsuccessful against the sheer weight and consistency of the evidence. The jury was presented with a coherent and terrifying picture of a criminal organization that had ordered the very public execution of a rival, and the testimony of a calm, detailed, and corroborated witness proved more powerful than attempts to impugn his morality. The convictions that followed were a landmark victory for the Justice Department and the FBI. They did not just convict a few hired hands, they decapitated the leadership of the entire Cleveland crime family, sending its boss, underboss, and other key figures to federal prison for the rest of their lives. The trial and its verdict sent shockwaves through the American underworld, demonstrating the potent new weapon the government now possessed, the ability to flip participants in a criminal conspiracy and use their testimony to destroy the entire structure from the top down. For the city of Cleveland, the trial provided a sense of catharsis and closure. The violence that had gripped their city for years had finally been adjudicated in a court of law, and the men responsible were held accountable. The story of Danny Greene had reached its final, irrevocable conclusion not with a bang in a parking lot, but with the sober pronouncement of a judge's gavel. The legal aftermath proved to be the most enduring and impactful chapter of all, ensuring that Greene's death was not in vain and that the empire he fought would be brought to its knees not by a rival's bomb, but by the very system of justice he himself had often flouted. The story of Danny Greene, when stripped of its romanticized layers and viewed through the cold, hard lens of historical analysis, presents a profound and unsettling series of contradictions that challenge our very definitions of a hero, a villain, and the nature of legacy itself. He was, by any objective measure, a ruthless criminal whose actions caused immense suffering, fear, and loss of life, a man who operated outside the bounds of civilized society and who used terror as a primary tool of his trade. The bombings, the extortion, the violence, these are not the deeds of a folk hero but of a dangerous and destructive force. To glorify him is to ignore the very real victims of his war, the families torn apart by the violence he both delivered and attracted, and the climate of fear that he helped to cultivate in the city he claimed to champion. Yet, to dismiss him as merely a thug is to ignore the undeniable elements of his character and his struggle that resonate on a deeply human level. His incredible courage, his unwavering defiance in the face of overwhelming power, and his steadfast loyalty to his own code and his community are qualities that, in a different context, would be universally admired. He was the ultimate underdog, and the human spirit is instinctively drawn to the narrative of the individual who stands up to the giant, regardless of the individual's own flaws. This is the central paradox of Danny Greene. He was a bad man who fought a worse system, a criminal whose personal war inadvertently served a form of public justice by crippling a predatory criminal monopoly. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is not a simple morality play with clear-cut heroes and villains, but a messy, ambiguous tapestry where light and dark are often intertwined. The public's enduring fascination with him stems from this very ambiguity. He does not fit neatly into a box. He was a murderer who could be charitable, a gangster who saw himself as a freedom fighter, a realist who believed in magic. This complexity makes him a far more interesting and enduring figure than a purely evil or purely good character could ever be. His legacy is therefore a dual one. On one hand, he is a cautionary tale about the self-destructive nature of the criminal path, a man whose ambition and defiance ultimately led him to a fiery and premature end. On the other hand, he is a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions are not invulnerable to the determined assault of a single, fearless individual. The city of Cleveland has had to grapple with this dual legacy for decades, acknowledging the darkness he brought while also recognizing the role he played in a pivotal chapter of its history. In the end, the story of Danny Greene is not a story with a moral, but a story about the complexities of the human condition. It is about the allure of power, the price of pride, the strength of belief, and the unpredictable ways in which one man's life can alter the course of events long after he is gone. He remains an enigma, a figure who can be viewed as either a monster or a martyr, and perhaps the most honest assessment is that he was a little of both, a man whose life serves as a dark mirror reflecting our own complicated understanding of justice, power, and the eternal struggle between the individual and the system. The final years and months of Danny Greene's life were a frantic and increasingly isolated descent into a world of pure survival, a period marked by the constant hum of paranoia, the erosion of his inner circle, and a grim awareness that the net was closing in around him no matter how many times he had previously slipped through its holes. The assassination of his key ally, John Nardi, in May of 1977 was a catastrophic blow, not just strategically but psychologically. It severed his most important connection to the world of organized labor and power politics, and it sent an unequivocal message that the Mafia was now targeting the very heart of the rebellion, systematically eliminating its leadership. Greene was suddenly alone, the last remaining public face of a war that had grown too costly and too bloody for anyone else to bear. His existence became increasingly nomadic and claustrophobic. He moved between a series of safe houses and apartments, never sleeping in the same place for too long, his routines becoming a complex dance designed to evade the ever-watchful eyes of his enemies. The Lyndhurst apartment was just one of these temporary bolt holes, a second-floor unit that offered a tactical advantage of visibility but also made him a sitting duck for the kind of remote attack that was being planned. The man who had once reveled in his public image, who drove distinctive green cars and held court in neighborhood bars, was now forced into the shadows, a ghost in his own city. His sources of intelligence, once robust thanks to his union connections and community ties, would have begun to dry up as people, terrified of the escalating violence, grew unwilling to talk. The constant state of high alert, the need to scan every face in a crowd, to check the underside of his car every time he approached it, to view every stranger as a potential assassin, must have been an exhausting and soul-crushing way to live. Yet, by all accounts, he never showed public fear. His trademark bravado remained intact. He continued to taunt his enemies, believing in his own legend and the protective magic of his Celtic symbols right up until the end. This outward display of fearlessness, however, likely masked the immense psychological toll of knowing that death could come at any moment, in any form. The very tactics he had pioneered, the car bombs, were now being turned against him with terrifying efficiency. The Mafia had learned, adapted, and were now deploying a more sophisticated and impersonal version of his own weapon of choice. The plot that culminated on October 6 was the culmination of this adaptation, a plan born from the Mafia's frustration and their recognition that killing Danny Greene required not a confrontation, but an annihilation. In his final days, Greene was a man living on borrowed time, a king without a kingdom, a warrior whose army had dwindled to a handful of trusted associates. He was still dangerous, still plotting, still believing he could win, but the world around him had contracted to the size of a few city blocks and a list of potential targets. The final morning, as he walked out of his apartment and into the parking lot, he was stepping into a trap that had been weeks in the making, a kill zone designed specifically for him. In that moment, the two forces that had defined his life, his unshakable belief in his own destiny and the ruthless, patient hatred of his enemies, collided with a force that finally surpassed even his legendary luck. His final years were not a slow decline but a rapid, violent burnout, a testament to the fact that in the world he had chosen, no one, not even the Irishman, could run forever. The ultimate and most profound irony in the entire saga of Danny Greene lies in the starkly different fates of the man and the organization he fought, a twist of historical fate that ensured his legend would grow in power even as the physical entity of the Cleveland Mafia withered into irrelevance. Greene died a sudden, violent, and in many ways, terrible death, torn apart by an explosion in a mundane parking lot, a final moment of chaos that seemed to confirm the brutal and unforgiving nature of the world he inhabited. It was an end that by all appearances represented a total victory for his enemies. They had finally succeeded in eliminating their most persistent and humiliating foe. They had reasserted their dominance and proven that defiance would be met with ultimate annihilation. Yet, this victory was an empty shell, a Pyrrhic triumph that contained the seeds of their own destruction. The bomb that killed Greene also blew apart the fragile veil of secrecy and operational security that had protected the Mafia for decades. It created a crime scene so large and so public that it demanded an unprecedented level of law enforcement response, focusing the full might of the FBI's Operation Lombardo directly onto the men who had ordered the hit. The key conspirator, Ray Ferritto, was flipped, and his testimony became the weapon that the government used to decapitate the entire Cleveland crime family. Bosses James Licavoli and Angelo Leonardo, who had presided over the empire that Greene challenged, were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, their power and their organization shattered. The Mafia, as a dominant force in Cleveland, never recovered from these legal blows. The structure, the tradition, the accumulated power of generations, was dismantled in a court of law, a defeat far more total and permanent than any Greene could have inflicted with his bombs. Meanwhile, the story of Danny Greene did not die with him. It was picked up by the media, examined by authors, and eventually dramatized in a major motion picture. His name, his image, and his legend grew, transforming him from a local Cleveland gangster into a national symbol of rebellion. The very things the Mafia killed him for, his flamboyance, his defiance, his very public challenge, became the cornerstone of his immortality. The empire that killed him to prove its strength was itself killed by the legal repercussions of that act, and is now largely a footnote in history, a disbanded criminal enterprise. The man they killed to erase from memory, however, is remembered, discussed, and analyzed. His green cars, his belief in Celtic magic, his miraculous survivals, and his final, dramatic demise have become the stuff of legend. The Mafia sought to teach a lesson about the futility of resistance, but the lesson history taught was the opposite, that a single determined individual can leave a mark so deep that it outlives the very empire that crushed him. Greene's grave may be a quiet, final resting place, but his story is anything but quiet. It continues to resonate, a powerful and unsettling narrative about power, pride, and the unpredictable consequences of violence. The Irishman, in death, achieved a form of victory that was forever denied to his killers. He became immortal, while they became inmates and then ghosts. This is the final, and perhaps most fitting, chapter in the story of Danny Greene, not the story of his death, but the story of how his death ensured that he would never be forgotten, and that the empire he hated would never be whole again. And so we reach the end of our journey through the turbulent and explosive life of Danny Greene, a story that stretches from the tough streets of Collinwood to the shattered silence of a Lyndhurst parking lot, a saga that has captivated and horrified in equal measure for decades. We have walked alongside the young Irishman as he learned the rules of power on the Cleveland docks, witnessed his meteoric rise through the ranks of the Longshoremen's Union where he built his first empire on a foundation of loyalty and fear. We felt the city tense as he declared his war, a one-man rebellion against the mighty Italian Mafia, a conflict fought not in shadowy alleys but in the harsh light of day with car bombs and taunting messages that challenged an entire criminal dynasty's right to rule. We held our breath with him through the miraculous survivals, the bullet that deflected from his skull, the ambushes he walked away from, each escape adding another layer to the legend of the untouchable Celtic warrior protected by ancient magic and his own indomitable will. We saw the alliances he forged, most crucially with John Nardi, and we felt the devastating impact of their severance, a loss that isolated the rebel and set the stage for the final act. We observed the cold, professional calculation of his enemies as they imported a specialist, Ray Ferritto, to craft a death that would be as final as it was spectacular. And we witnessed the culmination of all these forces on a crisp October morning in 1977, when a radio signal sent from a nearby apartment transformed a green Chevrolet into a fireball and sealed a legend in blood and fire. But the story did not end there. We followed the evidence, the patient work of the FBI, the forensic clues gathered from the devastating crime scene that would become the keys to justice. We sat in the courtroom and heard the damning testimony of a turned assassin, the words that would finally bring down the kings of the Cleveland underworld, achieving through the law what Greene could not achieve with his bombs. We have contemplated the complex legacy of this man, a violent criminal and a folk hero, a destroyer and a symbol of resistance, a figure whose life remains a subject of debate and fascination. We have seen how his personal beliefs, his flamboyant style, and his unshakable courage created a narrative so powerful that it has endured long after the smoke cleared and the courtrooms fell silent. The story of Danny Greene is a quintessential American story, a tale of ambition, identity, and the high cost of defiance. It is a reminder that history is written not only by the victorious, but by the unforgettable, by those whose lives burn with such intensity that they leave a permanent mark on the world. The war is over. The bombs are silent. But the echo of the Irishman's rebellion can still be heard if you listen closely, a whisper on the streets of Cleveland, a cautionary tale, a dark legend, and a testament to the fact that some men are simply too large for life to contain. Thank you for listening. We hope this journey into the life and times of Danny Greene has been both enlightening and captivating. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a true story that rivals any work of fiction, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel for more sleepy gangster stories, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a tale from the shadows of history. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these meticulously researched narratives to life. Until next time, sleep well, and remember the legends.